Hello, everyone. Welcome to episode 3 of our 4-part series, following the theme of what it means to be bold with New York Wines Online. So our host, Elaine Chukan Brown, will speak with producers from across the state's diverse wine regions, alongside other important industry players to explore the deep roots and fresh ground that define New York wine today. And today we are focusing on Long Island with 2 winery representatives. Some of you will have received tasting kits, so you have wines there to taste along. So I hope you have them ready. We'll go ahead and cue you as we get along in the conversation on when to try each of those wines. And before I hand it over to our host, just a few housekeeping notes. So I'd like to point out that there are 2 communication methods available to participants. We've got a chat section and then a Q&A section. So the chat section, informal way for you to communicate with other participants. And then the Q&A section is where we'd like you to submit your questions to be answered during the webinar. Note that all the questions are visible to all attendees. I know sometimes you can hide those, but just know that whenever you submit your question to the Q&A, it will be public. And then note that this session will also be recorded. Now, our host today is Elaine Chukan Brown. Elaine serves as a global wine educator and journalist, specializing in global initiatives for sustainability and climate action, most especially in US wine. Brown serves as a columnist for Decanter Magazine and previously served as executive editor for the US for JancisRobinson.com. And today, Elaine will be joined by Christopher Tracy of Channing Daughters Winery and Gabriella Macari of Macari Vineyards. So over to you, Elaine.
Thank you, Katie. I'm super excited to do this session with these 2. I actually have been lucky enough to spend more than a week in Long Island, and actually was able to drive around the area with these 2 and spend a lot of time getting to know vineyards on both the North and South Fork. And very importantly, the food scene in Long Island as well. Gabriella has been involved with Macari Vineyards since its inception in the mid-1990s, also grew up in Long Island, so is a really great resource for understanding the history and evolution of the place. She's also very involved in the local slow food movement and helping to raise awareness for both local food and wine. And now serves as Director of Operations for Macari Vineyards, and also is involved in the inception of a new wine project that we're going to talk about today. So I'll let her tell us about that in a little bit. Christopher Tracy actually previously worked as a chef in New York City, actually went to the French Culinary Institute there in Manhattan. But after studying performing arts and philosophy, something the 2 of us have in common, and he worked as a pastry sous chef at some of the top restaurants in the city before moving out to Long Island to work with Channing Daughters and eventually become partner and winemaker, helping to really shape the portfolio there. He also has studied wine extensively with his WSET diploma and helped bring a lot of awareness for wine education and wines of the world to Long Island through tasting and wine classes that he's hosted there at Channing Daughters. So we have a really great combination for the discussion of the area. To dig into it, though, Gabriella, I want to start with you because you have lived in and been connected to Long Island your whole life, but you also spend a lot of time in the city. And I think helping people understand that there's a long history of organic farming, both in food, gardens, CSAs, and also in wine there in the region. And there's incredible produce. I regularly tell people that the best asparagus in the country is from Long Island. I couldn't believe that asparagus is totally site expressive. It absolutely is. And I got to have that experience there in Long Island. So, but it's right there, right beside the city. And yet a lot of people don't realize how much is there. So could you just give us that context? Tell us about how far away is it, and tell us more about that food and wine scene there.
Sure. We're 2 hours away from New York City, which is mind-blowing to a lot of people. I always do, if you can see me right now, I do the sideways peace sign, right? So New York is here, and then we split off to the North and the South Forks. And the most beautiful thing is that we're surrounded by water. So there's my brother's a fisherman. I mean, my friends are oyster farmers. And there's just a scene kind of that people don't necessarily realize. You can see like that part where on the map on the screen where it's red is super densely populated. And then as you sort of head further east, you see less and less people and more farms. And we're working hard to keep it that way. There are almost 8 million people on Long Island. It's densely populated for sure, but the proximity, to New York City is really important for our wine scene, but also for the local farmers. And then you can kind of see here too how close we are to Connecticut. So there's a ferry that sort of shuttles you right up, which is incredibly important for direct to consumer sales and visitation. We see people from Boston and Connecticut come through the ferry, and it's just a quick ride. It's a day trip. So location. We're super lucky to be where we are. And to touch on your point about farming, there's just been a massive, the history of farming on Long Island goes so far back, but from our perspective, most of the vineyards were potato farms.
Right.
So there's just been a shift.
Yeah. And so other produce has really taken a foothold. Christopher, you and I were talking the other day, though, about how protections have been put in place in the waters off Long Island, and the seafood has been coming closer and closer to shore. But as we saw on the map a moment ago, Channing Daughters is located in the South Fork. And in this series, we've talked about the role of lakes in moderating climate, the role that a river can take in that. But Long Island, importantly, is situated literally in the ocean. But the South Fork is actually facing the ocean, and the North Fork is still surrounded by it, but slightly more protected. You're located there on the South Fork with Channing Daughters, but you work with vineyards on the North Fork too. So you're a perfect person to kind of help us understand that similarity and contrast between the two and the role the ocean plays. Could you tell us more about that?
Sure. You want to put that map back up too? It's helpful. Long Island, both the North and the South Fork, were the breadbasket for New York City for centuries, hundreds of years. And you can see on the South Fork too, there's actually more plantable land available than there is on the North Fork. But so much of the real estate, starting in the 1800s, really started getting bought up by people that wanted to come out and spend time and be closer to the ocean. So you can see that, we have south-facing beaches to the Atlantic Ocean. Channing Daughters is about 3 miles, as the crow flies, to the ocean. And then if you look to the north, about another 3 or so miles to the Great Paumanok Bay, which is the giant, beautiful bay that separates the North and the South Fork. And then you have the North Fork, and then on the north of the North Fork, you have the Long Island Sound. So these, 3 bodies of water are what moderate our climate, as water always does. So we warmer in the winter and cooler in the summer, which is why people, especially from the metropolitan area in New York City, wanted to get out here and be close to the ocean for the cooling effects that the water has. So, especially until recently, that meant no spring frosts, though we did have one this year, as you probably talked about, and a lot of the Finger Lakes and upstate and Hudson Valley got nailed. Most of the North Fork was spared, but we did see some stuff on the South Fork and some low spots. But so until recently, no spring frosts, and then the latest frost in the fall as well. So, we're a moderate maritime district that practices cool climate viticulture, and if that makes sense, because the growing season is particularly long. And there goes my dog. And we have all the wonderful benefits and the positive and pejorative things that come with all that water, and being a maritime district and having growing season rain and humidity too. So that gives us lots of opportunities and lots of challenges.
Well, so one of the things that's important for viewers to know is that Long Island is really unique in New York State wine, in that the history of New York State wine is based very heavily in native grapes, and then moves in the 1800s into hybrid grapes. But a lot of the state didn't get into vinifera until the second half of the last century. But Long Island's entire history is based in vinifera. So this session looking at Long Island wine is a contrast in that sense to the previous 2 sessions where we were mixing hybrids and vinifera together in the conversation. Or hybrids rather have started to appear in kind of a research sense in Long Island, but the wine industry is very much focused around vinifera. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. I want to make sure that we talk through the wines. Not everybody has a wine kit, but that's okay because we're going to just use the wines as touchstones for larger conversations. I'm really excited though, because starting with the first two wines that our hosts are providing, they're actually two different versions of a skin contact wine from sibling varieties. So with the first one, Gabriella, let's go ahead and talk through yours. This is actually a really special wine to be showing. The first time Gabriella and I had emailed, but the first time we met years ago now, I found out that they had a little tiny bit of accidental Pinot Meunier in their vineyard, and they were planning on getting rid of it. And I was like, no, my God, you have to keep it. Please just keep the Pinot Meunier. I'm positive you can do something with it. And so I'm going to be bold and say that we have this Pinot Meunier Rosé to taste today
because of you.
Started an argument for it years
Yes.
ago. So thank you for that. But this is a really special label, and it represents your commitment to really local food and wine culture. And so could you tell us a little bit more about that?
Sure. In the cellar and in the vineyard, we get bored, right? Like, we really like to be creative. So while we're making the wines that we really believe in, we want to experiment and push the boundaries a little bit. We are still a young wine region. I mean, we've only been making wine for 28 years, which feels like forever. But in the grand scheme of things, we're still figuring things out. And so Meadowlark North Fork is a tasting room my grandfather bought actually from the bank. It was owned by a winery called Belluccio and Christina many moons ago. And they really were working towards quality in the beginning stages of founding the region. And we didn't do much with the tasting room. And post-COVID, I just realized that people wanted to come and experience the North Fork more than ever. I realized that people wanted to hang out at wineries and taste wine and drink wine and kind of really be part of the culture of the North Fork. And so we opened Meadowlark North Fork with the sort of, I guess, with some super small production wines. And that's what this Pinot Meunier is. We have a really thirsty wine club that is always begging for Pinot, and they love Pinot Meunier and Pinot Noir, but they like the reds, right? They're always like, when are you going to make that Pinot? And we really try, but the thin skins of the grape really create an issue. It's super susceptible to disease. And there's a lot of pressure to get, especially when my brother's out in the vineyard, getting nervous, pressure to get the fruit off the vine. So we had to hustle to get this fruit off the vine, and it was somewhere between the red and the white, and it wasn't quite ripe enough to be red. But instead of making a kind of simple rosé, we just pushed it forward. So I can talk about the winemaking a little later, but I think you can obviously tell that this is a longer maceration than most rosé, and there's clearly texture here.
Well, so I love this example though, because Christopher alluded to the point that you just brought up too, that because it's maritime, there is more disease pressure in some years, and this rosé becomes a solution. It's like the flexibility you're describing with the brand that you've created, Meadowlark, allows you the room to make choices. But could you tell us briefly too, I mean, 2021, if I remember correctly, was a little bit of a challenging year as well, wasn't it?
It was okay for us. We were dealing with a series of terrible years. Like 18, we didn't make any red. 19 was cool. 2021, 22, I would confidently say have been a series of better vintages for us. I'm super excited about what's in barrel. The 22s, I think, are show-stopping, kind of wake up and start drinking New York wine. You need to do this now. So that's coming. That's in the future. It's super exciting. But 21 for us, great. I mean, I think we just get that rain, we get that pressure in the beginning of the season. So when we were fingers crossed trying to let this go and hang on to be red, it was just not making it. But the thicker skin grapes made it, right? So we just bottled a beautiful Bordeaux blend from 21 that has density and weight. It just like needed to get through the rain.
Well, so with the last episode, those of you that saw it will remember our big tip giveaway was that, oh my God, Gamay, people need to be getting on New York Gamay. But this episode, it's like, keep an eye out for 2022 reds. And if you're in a buying position, you should be starting to ask your distributors and reps to be bringing those to you, to be keeping an eye out for them, because they're going to start coming out. A lot of them won't come out for a little bit, but keep that in mind. But Christopher, Rosé has been such a huge part of the Long Island story, and I really actually think it helped open up the idea of drinking local wine, especially in the Hamptons, but also kind of became a gateway to people realizing New York wine was happening in a broader context too, even outside the state. Because I think, what I saw when visiting and what I've seen since is just this increasing push for rosé in the area at the same time that there's been more national interest in rosé. But you have actually approached that in a really unique way. At Channing Daughters, you've made multiple rosés at once and across all kinds of different varieties, and some of them really not very known at all. And what I love about what you've done there resembles what I'm seeing in this rosé too. It's just very textural. There's even this kind of saline-like stimulation. I don't mean that the wine's salty, but it's like that's kind of stimulation on the palate. And so could you talk to us a little bit more about, the way rosé has evolved in Long Island, and how you see the category operating there now?
Long Island rosé is world class. It's as good as rosé from anywhere in the world, and you can put them together and taste for yourself and prove it. And we're lucky on Long Island. We can ripen a diverse array of different grape varieties, red and white, and make a huge spectrum of wine styles from them. And we have vintage variation, but as we all know too, vintage variation is ameliorated a lot these days by knowledge, viticulture, winemaking, all these sort of things. So we can make great wines no matter what's thrown at us in any vintage. But it's definitely true that some vintages are more conducive and easier in some senses to make reds, for instance, or whites or sparklings. But every vintage is great for rosé because it has the qualities of all of those things. It has the qualities of white wines and red wines. And when rosés, in my opinion, are made intentionally, namely fruit that's grown for a rosé wine, not part of a red wine program as an afterthought in some senses, but specifically grown for that. So you're not only getting what you want aromatically and texturally and flavor-wise, but analytically too, in terms of acid and alcohol potential and all those things. Long Island just has an amazing potential for just delicious, dynamic, versatile rosés from a variety of different grapes and different sites. So since 2005, we've been making anywhere between 5 and 8 rosés every vintage, celebrating the specific variety, made the same way, so you can really celebrate the deliciousness and the place, the reflection of the place for that grape variety from that site. And I think that almost all the producers make rosé, and we have people like Wolfer, obviously, and Roman, who have taken a national and international global charge on rosé that has obviously helped the region and the region's reputation for rosé and the appreciation of rosé. And then you have people like us doing with what we're doing with rosé on a much smaller scale. We might make 2,000 to 4,000 cases of rosé, depending on the vintage, not 120,000 cases like Wolfer. But it's important to have a producer like that too, who's now gone with the success of their rosé in this region and brought rosés from Provence and Argentina as well. And the best ones are still from Long Island, not the Provence or the Argentinian ones. So if people are looking for just really dynamic, delicious rosé from in a whole range of styles too, including, people are making white wines from red fruit now too, truly white wines, because like the color for our rosés just comes from the time in the press. So they can be really, very quite pale with little pigment at all, but still great red fruit character. And that's, again, one of the things that Long Island gives us is that ripeness of fruit within a frame of moderate alcohol with juicy, vibrant, refreshing acidity. And a reflection of place and textures that are dynamic. So that's pretty much what you want in a glass of wine.
Right. Well, so Gabriella, this particular rosé, I think, again, it's tons of palate stimulation, but then still all this sort of textural viscosity and weight is not quite the right word, but it has a real profound presence in the mouth. And the truth is, I think a lot of people are aware of Pinot Meunier because of its role in sparkling wine. And this is not, this is such a different kind of wine. And that visit I was referencing earlier, the first time I went to your winery and met you, you were making a little bit of red, but you really, you alluded to this earlier, you really played with the skin contact time on this particular wine. And so could you tell us about that, and also just the winemaking and growing in general?
Sure. Yeah. 48 hours. We've been talking about lees nonstop in the cellar, and we sat down with a friend from Napa, and he just kind of was like, how do you make these wines better? Your whites are good, but how do you make them better? And we've been talking to people in New Zealand and talking about what they're doing with lees, Kumu River, and what other people in France are doing with lees. And I just feel like we've been in America just so scared of lees and so scared of reduction, and the wine kind of like becoming reduced and not smelling great. And like what we're doing is pulling these wines off the gross lees way too soon, and like subjecting the wine to like potentially not getting the body or texture, viscosity, concentration that it could have had if it sat on the lees. So we pushed this as far as we thought we could. We kept tasting it over and over. It was 3 months on the gross lees without racking, and yeah, of course, the color and the sort of like broad-shouldered nature of this wine comes from 48 hours on the skins. Everything was destemmed, no whole cluster here, but we just really wanted to just see what would happen. And I think that's the beauty of like kind of my family being involved and just kind of having a thirst for pushing the quality forward. Is we're never going to know if we don't experiment, right? So let's just see what happens with a rosé. And I think, to Christopher's point, is like people are interested in the category now, so they're interested, maybe the gateway is this like Provençal style that doesn't have that texture, but let's just keep pushing this forward and get people interested in more textured whites and whites with tannin, you know what I mean? Or like rosés with texture. And I think that those wines become more food friendly than your gateway kind of Provençal style. That's not to say we're not making that. We are making it, and it literally just sold out last week.
Yeah, because you're making
it's nuts.
Because you're making multiple rosés as well. And we should point out too, this is an incredibly small production wine that we're lucky enough to taste today.
Yeah, exactly. We made 100 cases. 101 cases. So it's and it's funny, like we released it 21, but we weren't really open fully at that location. And I think it's actually benefited from some time in the bottle. So it's almost like it's like, by the way, you can age your rosé. Yeah, you can age your
have
rosé,
everybody
guys.
Get over the fresh rosé. Give me the new rosé 5 months after. It's ridiculous. The rosés are always a better year out, but nobody wants to hear that.
Always when they're sold out.
So I've mentioned this elsewhere before, but Pinot Meunier is actually the grape variety that caused me to quit my previous career and take this huge risk and decide and work in wine. So we might be having your Pinot Meunier today because I argued for it, but we're also here talking about wine because Pinot Meunier made me do it. So I love the synchronicity of that. But the reason I bring that up is because I have literally spent the last forever following Pinot Meunier all over the world and tasting it and trying to understand the variety and why I'm so enthralled by it. And for me, like, it's described as fruity in all these various ways, but actually in my mind, the core charm of Pinot Meunier is its subtlety and delicacy, that it's this very subtle, very fine-grained grape. And that it, at its best, it's really unadulterated. New oak obliterates what's unique about it and differentiates it from Pinot Noir. And overripeness absolutely erases its subtlety. Like, there's all these things about it. But what's cool to me about this rosé is that extended skin contact is capturing the flavor of the place and the variety, but it's still maintaining that really light, delicate, lifted, subtle character of Pinot Meunier. And so I like how you've brought those two things together. It's really beautiful and super food friendly. This is a wine for a meal, like you were saying. So this technique, though, that Gabriella was just talking about, I love, Christopher, that it really rolls us right into the second wine we're going to talk about, which is your Channing daughter's Ramato, and actually also from the 21 vintage. And so, this is again a skin contact wine from the sibling of Pinot Meunier, Pinot Grigio. And I want to remind everyone that in its history, in its origins, Pinot Grigio is considered one of the world's noble varieties. And I think it's really important to remind us of that, because in recent years, it's tended to be disregarded by serious wine people. But Christopher, you have this long-standing inspiration from various parts of Italy, northeastern Italy, and Friuli is one of them. And I think originally that's how you and I actually connected, because we both had this love for Friuli. And this technique of Ramato, this style Ramato, it originates there with this grape. So could you tell us more about that history and how it shows up working with it in Long Island?
Sure. So we've been, yeah, I mean, you're right. We have a fascination with all sorts of wine districts, but Friuli is one of the ones that is near and dear to our heart. And yeah, I do think we initially hooked up over that. And we're fascinated with, the grape varieties that come from there and the styles of wine that come from there. And we're interested in history, and we're constantly, students of wine. And whenever you look back in history, wine was made like this more often than not. And so, this and our vermouth project too, started because of looking back and seeing how things were made and how deliciousness was created and place and terroir was reflected. And so we've been making skin contact white since 2004. So for for a fairly long time, especially in the States. And yeah, Ramato is the traditional way of fermenting a Pinot Grigio on its skins, and could range from literally almost a white wine through, amber, or what people like to call orange wines now, through to, almost light red wines, depending on the vintage, the site, the clone, because Pinot Grigio grapes range that in those colors too. And we make a Pinot Grigio as well, I guess a more modern, I guess one could say, style Pinot Grigio, hand harvested, whole cluster pressed, fermented in stainless steel. We used to put some older oak, but now it's just back in steel again. So, and we tend to call it Pinot Grigio as opposed to Pinot Gris because it has more acid than what you'd find in Pinot Gris. When I think of Pinot Gris, I think of Alsace, especially. That one could think of Burgundy as well, for sure. But still, it has more acid because of our climate. So the wines are juicier, intended to still have the texture, still have the weight and concentration of aroma and flavor, have the complexity, but tended to remind me of the best examples from Northeast Italy, like the Schiappettos or the Luvia Falugas, or the Franco Toros, or some of those Pinot Grigios that have real character and weight and style and deliciousness, and are not the industrial examples that we see more from Trentino, really made in large quantities, that give Pinot Grigio its bad rap with fairly watery, thin wines. So we love to celebrate Pinot Grigio in both its styles, though it's amazing to me, we make 200 to 400 cases of that modern, white label Pinot Grigio that we make 800 to 1,200 cases of this. So it's kind of crazy. That
so you're getting a stronger response to the Ramato style? Well,
we can, from year to yeah. I mean, that's not stronger response, but I can easily sell those 300 or 400 cases of, that modern style Pinot Grigio as opposed to the 800 or 1,200 cases of this. Right. I mean, granted, this is in more markets, around the world. And I mean, well, like in England and some other places and around the United States as well. But it's for what we're interested in about skin fermented white wines is I love the meditative aspect of, we make a wine called Meditazione, and what vino de meditazione is. But it's not just an intellectual exercise or historical exercise for me. I'm much more of a hedonist, and while that's important to me, I want the wines to be delicious. And I find that our wine, and one of the reasons is because we clean them up a little bit more, and they have more clarity of appearance, clarity of aroma, clarity of texture, clarity of flavor, and you can finish the bottle, and you want to finish it, and you want to pair it with foods. And that's important to me. And at $26 a bottle, this wine's a real entryway into that skin fermented world at a price point that's way below, many of the other examples, especially of the best ones, and has all of that to offer. I mean, we make 5 or 6 different skin fermented whites, at this point, and they're all pretty small productions, save for the Ramato. But it's just a super expressive, delicious, fun, and has so many options to pair with food. And that's one of the things, I mean, that's why we make so many different wines at Channing Daughters, is because there's different, I've said it a million times, moods and foods and people and places to pair those wines with.
Yeah.
So
Well, so Gabriella, too, one of the things I want to be sure and mention too is like you've actually passed your MW exam. So you've like thoroughly studied wines from all over the world. You're currently working on your research paper for the MW, but this style of wine, it's such an example. Also, for those that have the wine kit, there's such a textural and weight parallel between these first two wines. It's very cool to taste back and forth. But thinking about this particular example, it's such an example of an international influence, like learning, saying, wait, okay, this is what we have here, but I learned from seeing this thing in this other part of the world, and I can take that here, and I see that happening more and more. There's more of an evolution with Long Island wine, I think, where people are realizing they can get creative there, but also learn from what's being done elsewhere and play with it there. So, and you were talking about experimentation earlier. So can you just comment on that the evolution of like whites being taken more seriously and having a greater range of expression there in the region?
Sure. And first, I would say that this wine is showing so beautifully, even out of this little bottle right now. And what I love about Skin Contact, before I get into the sort of like the whites and the evolution and the inspiration, is just that like it evolves. So like Christopher, I bet in tank this tasted and smelled so differently than it does today, right? And it just like we co-fermented some Pinot Gris with Friulano, and it was super fun. But like it is night and day right now from where it was in tank. And I think that's the joy of wine, is just like where it goes, and every single time you open a bottle, it just keeps changing. And so I just wanted to say that because it's so obvious that every time I taste this wine, Christopher, it's different, but it's exciting, and with time, I'm sure it just even gets more and more beautiful. But yeah, it's funny. I was reading one of Jamie Good's book, and it was about what Rouleau is doing in Burgundy, and I like called everybody in the cellar, and we had a meeting, like an emergency meeting. I was like, we've got to get more turbid ferments. Why are we racking so quickly? What are we doing with the Chardonnay program? Why are we whole cluster pressing? Why is everyone whole cluster pressing on the East End? Let's crush the grapes. Like, let's get some texture in there. And I think just like that sort of absorbing knowledge from other people, I'm not emulating, like we're not emulating what Rouleau is doing. We're not emulating what other people are doing in different areas. And I bet Christopher is not emulating, like he's not trying to be exactly like what the Radicon and Gravner are doing, but like we're kind of making it our own, and we have our own climate. And I think that's the fun, is like how far can you push these concepts? And it's a little bit of like what, in my opinion, like what's new was once commonplace and old. You know what I mean? Like it's like no one used to whole cluster press. Everyone crushed the grapes because it was easier. You fit more in the press. And now all of a sudden it's like, oh, delicate pressing. Like, let's get over it.
I think it's such an important conversation because, in the midst of this, like our whole climate, our vintages are we can't predict what's happening so quickly, so readily anymore. Everything is changing so much. But the more we learn from what has been done, the more we can actually use that historical knowledge as a point of innovation now. Sometimes I think we assume innovation is technology and robotics and chemistry, when actually innovation is taking a known technique into a new context. That's actually innovation. And that point you're making about turbidity, even in aromatic whites, maybe that's actually a really important move, So I love that as another example of adopting a lesson from somewhere else. So thinking about innovation, though, like another example is, we unfortunately can't send sparkling wine in these wine kits, but sparkling wine has been a really important part of the history of Long Island. And it's important for people to know traditional method sparkling wines have been in the region for a very long time. There's some really beautiful examples. But Christopher, you really invested in pet nats. And just like we've heard with Skin Contact whites and rosés, you've actually made as 6 to 8 in some years different pet nats. And I would really argue that your doing that helped inspire other people making pet nats, not just in Long Island, but I think it's had a national influence actually. And so could you tell us a little bit about traditional method sparkling wines there, and also why pet nat and how you see it working in the region?
Totally. Traditional method method champenoise, traditional method here in the States is hugely important on Long Island. And Long Island is so geared for sparkling wine production because of the quality of the fruit. And there's so many varieties that we can use, not just Chardonnay, Pinot Noir, and Pinot Meunier, but there's a ton of other varieties, not just the champagne varieties, that can make delicious sparkling wines. And the three most important people for me and for the region here in Long Island were Eric Fry, who was at Lenz for years and years and years. Tom Spodek is there now and has taken over and was Eric's assistant, but Eric was there, I think, until 2018 from the inception. And then Roman Roth at Wolfer, and then Gilles Martin at Sparkling Point. And those three guys have made awesome sparkling wines over the years. And, Eric would make RD versions that he, disgorged 20 years after they were on their lees. And you'd put them up against, Bollinger and RD wines, and they were totally different, but just as good. And so it's really important to drink those wines and know those wines, and celebrate the history and the future of traditional method sparkling wines on Long Island. For us at Channing Daughters, it was just too expensive, took too much time, too much of a capital cost for equipment, too much labor. There were just too many things that cost too much for us at the moment, and that we wanted to make sparkling wines, and we kept wanting to make sparkling wines, and Allison kept saying make sparkling wines. So again, looking back in history, how we're, some of the first sparkling wines made were the Method Ancestral wines, and it made perfect sense again for our fruit, our climate, our terroir, and our culture, and for me and who I am and how I like to make wine and celebrate wine. It was like it was a kismet, to figure out that style. And start experimenting with it, and then find our own sort of way and interpretation of it. Because once again, there's room for interpretation within that category. And we don't disgorge those wines, but once again, I do clean them up. So I have consistency across all of the pet nats, through the bottling, and they taste the same and open the same and show the same. And that's super important for me. And I'm always trying to create exactitude within a very inexact style. Right, and that's some of the fun and challenge of Method Ancestral, because they're a real pain in the ass to make, because there's such a crapshoot, and that it's all about timing in so many senses. And it's not like we have, like gas spectrometers, or whatever to be measuring this. If I want to measure something, I got to send it out to a lab, other than like trying to triangulate between like Clinitest tablets, hydrometers, and my own palate, or something, and figure out where exactly that wine is in terms of what the alcohol is going to be, what the bar, how sparkling it's going to be, what the residual sugar is going to be, to capture that wine and then put it in the bottle. So yeah, Method Ancestrals, pet nats were exciting and a great solution for us to make delicious sparkling wines that are even more playful than, I love champagne and I love traditional method, but they're more austere. It's just a different style. And I love that, and especially with certain foods. But I also love the playfulness and the seriousness of pet nats. Believe me, they age well and really, really well, just like just like traditional method, especially because there's more lees in the bottle. So it's like you're aging them on their lees anyway. So they get really interesting characters, but they're playful and fun, and whether they're bone dry or have a little bit of residual sugar or slightly sweet, they're low in alcohol, they have tons of potential at the table.
Well, they get into the textural point that we keep talking about with these different wines there. And one of the things to know about Long Island is there's people making a lot of different styles of sparkling wine all over both the North and South Fork now, which has been really exciting to see. And there's just a growth everywhere. So I want to make sure I'm managing time. But Gabriella, I want to take a few minutes to talk about the farming piece that we got into hints of it earlier, but you have had a strong commitment to the local food movement there. But part of that for you, is from what I understand, is recognizing that taking care of the local farming, like the land itself, is really crucial to sustain the local foods. And so regenerative agriculture has been important to you. And through Macari, you and your family have had a strong commitment to soil health. So could we just take a couple minutes, because I want to make sure we keep talking about the other wines too, but tell us just a little bit more about examples of that, because I think, again, it's another way that you have been able to look at techniques that have been successful elsewhere and see how you can apply them to what you're doing there in Long Island.
Sure. In 95, we were about to plant and someone told my dad he had to spray, a book of different chemicals, and that the kids, my brothers and I couldn't be on the farm, and he just felt in his gut it was wrong. So he actually hired a man named Alan York, who sadly passed away, but he planted Fetzer, and the movie Big Little Farm is about him. And anyways, Alan was a visionary, and he told us we had to get a cow. So we have a herd of cows since 95, and we compost. And just to touch back on what Christopher said earlier, just how vintage variation is now kind of ameliorated by viticulture, I'm finding that our soil work that you're seeing other people really kind of devote to on Long Island is creating more resilience, right? So the composting, for example, that we do, we were just talking about the drought that we were in this year, and I'm finding that the vines are resilient. There's moisture in the soil because we've been composting. There's moisture in the soil because we don't use herbicide. There's moisture in the soil because we're really focusing on what's growing between our vines. And I think that
you don't till.
We're not tilling, right? You don't see tilling on Long Island, and that's for some people are like, what? We need that competition with native grass because it's so wet. So that's another beautiful point, right? So everyone's talking about carbon sequestering, and you're kind of sitting here thinking like, well, we're not, the most we do is maybe a Clemens, right? Drives down the row to sort of help the weeds between the vines. But soil work is a labor of love, and we're super passionate about it. And it's caused us, it's financially a lot of work to manage the cows and the compost and really devote to it. But you're seeing a lot of producers really shifting and moving forward this way. And it's super, super inspiring.
Well, Long Island has played a really strong role in driving sustainability efforts forward for quite a long time, and really was at the forefront of helping create certifications in the region too. And so there's just been a strong foothold of recognizing the importance of, to be an agricultural region, you have to take care of the ground itself. And so it's great to see that. I want to manage time. We're going to keep talking about different aspects of Long Island wine, but let's go ahead and look at wine 3, which I'm thrilled to have here because it's an aromatic white, literally called Aromatico. And I think one of the most important things in the last 10 years of American wine has been the move towards taking white wine seriously. And taking white wine seriously means recognizing there's such a huge range of potential styles possible. And so, Christopher, you have done so much work with blending lots of different varieties. So I was hoping you could tell us a little bit about just that idea of blending whites. I think it's become more acceptable more recently. One of the differences I would say between something like Italian wines and American wine culture is that Italian wine has always understood blends are vintage insurance. Blends bring the deliciousness that you're so committed to. Blends give us opportunity. In American wine culture, though, we got really attached to the idea of variety. And so this notion of accepting blends is more recent, but we have culturally started to do that more. So this is a blend of 2 highly aromatic grapes, Muscat and Malvasia. The wine was done at the very long, slow, cool ferment in order to really retain those aromatics. And again, very low alcohol, you can see here too. But so Christopher, can we just briefly, can you just talk about that idea of blending whites and how you see that evolving in Long Island?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, we are committed to blends, obviously. And look, all wines are blends. Even varietal wines are blends of clones of different parts of the vineyard, of different vessels that they were fermented in. I mean, it's rare that you have like a single barrel from one block of, they exist for sure. We can go to Burgundy, have some examples, but even most of those wines are blends, but they bring more complete, complex, and delicious opportunities when you have blends. And like you said, it's not only vintage, you can just do so much. They're just raw materials that we get to work with and decide how they go. And when I first came to Long Island and started making wine in 2001 at Channing Daughters. The first wine I made, well, the first two wines I made, one was a barrel fermented, ambient, wild, spontaneous fermented Chardonnay, because there weren't any out here then that were being released, and Vino Bianco, which was a blend, is now a blend of 4 grapes, Chardonnay, Pinot Grigio, Tokaj Friulano, and Sauvignon Blanc. And back then, it was 2001 was Pinot Grigio, Sauv Blanc, and Chardonnay, because our first vintage of Tokaj was 2002. But I got out here and I was like, there's Sauvignon Blanc, there's Chardonnay, there's Pinot Grigio. These wines are all delicious on their own. Why are there no white blends? I'm drinking all these amazing white blends from all these other districts, especially Friuli. I mean, those symphonic white blends were made up of those varieties. And I was like, why aren't we doing this? So in 2001, I created that first vintage of Vino Bianco. And I'm so psyched because now white blends are a strong category in Long Island wine, and people get it because they're delicious and they reflect our place really, really, really well.
Well, and I think it's one of the things Long Island does exceptionally well is white blends. And, you know, we're obviously having a very white focused tasting. You know, if you argue rosé is basically a red made like a white, but and the thing that's amazing to me too, I just jumped ahead and tasted the Pinot Blanc too, which we're about to start talking about, but there's this kind of signature across these first wines. Like there's this tons of palate stimulation, this almost glittering mineral combo, where again, it's saline-like, not salty, but saline-like in terms of like opening up your palate. And then there's this glittering acidity, and the two are really appearing together in the palate. And I get that across each of these 4 wines. There's even almost some flavor comparisons between the Muscat Malvasia and the Pinot Grigio. And I think that the reason I'm bringing this up is because it denotes wines that really are clearly all from the same place. And so being lucky enough to have a lineup like this, it's like, I didn't know that we were going to get that, having these side by
that
side.
salty minerality thing has just gotten stronger and stronger and stronger.
Well, and it's in the asparagus. It's in the asparagus from Long Island.
Everything.
It's why they're so good. Go to Long Island,
so
you get asparagus.
No, it's like the vegetables are seasoned before you even have to eat them. You know?
Yeah, and you can eat them right out of the ground. They're amazing. All of them are so good.
But it's true, and we see that across all, you know, all the hues, all the colors of wine. You'll find that minerality and that savory, salty character matched with refreshing acidity and moderate alcohol, and then you can talk about the aroma and character of the particular fruit. That's awesome, and it is telltale Long Island. You know.
Yeah. The so Gabriella, this wine 4, let's go ahead and start talking about that. It's the Lieb Pinot Blanc. So we do here have 100% Pinot Blanc. But this is a 2022. So could you tell us a little bit more? You know, I recall this being a vintage that really stood out as positive for a lot of people, but could you tell us a little bit more about the vintage, since we've been tasting only 21 so far?
Honestly, I mean, one probably the best. I don't know, Christopher, if you agree with me, but at least where we were, the best growing conditions I've seen. 2010 was lauded as, 2010 was incredible, and what you found in 10 was just hot. Like the New York Times said, this article was like in 2010, it was like, stay inside, you'll die if you go outside. It was hot, and 15 was hot, but like 22 was warm. And we didn't have that much rain, right? So there wasn't that much disease pressure, and the humidity was pretty balanced, and it wasn't hot. So like you're still seeing 11.9 here. My reds that we just bottled, like the Bordeaux blends that we're so proud of, have inky, beautiful color, but 13% alcohol. So I always joke that, you know, we're making like Bordeaux from the 70s, right? Like we're like, it's like cool. It's a cool climate, but the fruit ripens. It's a short growing season. But yeah, 22, I'm super excited about. I think our whites are almost sold out. Like our Sauvignon Blanc is about to sell out, which is crazy. And there's just a thirst, you know, to comment on the whites on Long Island. There's a massive thirst for white wine, and they're getting better and better. And I'm finding in the past, it was always like, you know, when everyone first started, it was that sort of like, show us your best red. Your best red is going to get the Parker points. Your best red will get into Spectator, and your best red will be on the tablecloths, you know, in New York City. But now it's like, hey, we got these whites are delicious, and they also should share the stage. with the reds, and they
Absolutely,
can
yeah.
age.
Well, that's the thing. So that we should note, Long Island just went through a huge anniversary in terms of the age of the wine growing region as a whole. And so happy birthday to Long Island. Do one of you want to tell us what year anniversary it is for the region?
50. Pretty
50.
cool.
So we want to be sure to emphasize that, because there you can actually go around, and if you go to some of the wineries that have been there for a significantly long time, you really actually can taste older vintages of both reds and whites that absolutely demonstrate the ageability of Long Island wines. And I think because it's outside the city, sometimes people think, oh no, those wines are for tourists, but actually there's a whole history of really serious wine growing and winemaking, and wines that demonstrate the ageability. The thing I want to be sure to note about this Pinot Blanc, it is so aromatic. Pinot Blanc is often very muted, but this particular wine really speaks to, like, it shows that it had that warmth that Gabriella was describing. Like, there's that full expression of aromatics and flavor that's really beautiful, but it's still light on the palate. It still has that glittering acidity. And so it's like, this is an example. It's hard to find really exceptional Pinot Blanc in the United States, to be honest. And this is a really nice example of one. So I want to make sure and note that. But we have two reds we want to talk about as well. Long Island really got, in terms of reds, it really got started with the history of Merlot. It's very strong investment in Merlot, which I must say the region does do very well. But right alongside it, Cabernet Franc kind of kept holding its own alongside Merlot. And when Merlot unfortunately got a knock upside the head about 20 years ago, Cab Franc started to sort of take its place in Long Island a little bit. So we wanted to be sure to talk about a Cab Franc, and Lenz sent their 2020. And Christopher, you again are working with some Long Island or North Fork vineyards as well. And even though it's, there's so much similarity between the North Fork and South Fork, but the North Fork is just slightly warmer enough that we can ripen these thicker skinned, hardier reds. So could you tell us just a little bit more about that contrast? What is it about the North Fork that allows red wines like this to grow and ripen there?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, look, like this goes back to your first question where we started for our dog so rudely interrupted. And, but, the reds become more site specific, and for the North and the South Fork. And there's as much similarity between the North and the South Fork as there is differences. And the differences between Bridgehampton, where we are, and Southold are as great as the differences between Riverhead and Greenport in many senses. But we are, because of the ocean on the South Fork, 1 or 0 to 1 or 2 degrees cooler. And we do get more fog and a little bit just more of that ocean cooling effect, which can result sometimes in 0 to 6 or 7 or 8 days difference in bud break or harvest times too. There's several varieties that we grow on both the North and the South Fork. Tokaj Friulano for one, Blaufränkisch, Dornfelder, Pinot Grigio, Muscat, Merlot. So, I see those, and generally that's about right, depending on the vintage. So it is sometimes easier, especially with Cabernet Sauvignon and Cabernet Franc, especially those two varieties, to ripen in certain spots on the North Fork, which is why the Cab Franc that we use both for rosé and for red wine comes from the North Fork. And we don't have any Cab Franc on our estate in Bridgehampton, though we do have, like I said, Merlot, which ripens quite well on the South Fork in certain spots again, and Lagrein and Blaufränkisch and Rethosco and Giraldago and Dornfelder, but no Cabernet Sauvignon, which, Kareem and at Paumanok and these guys at Lenz, Tom and Eric, used to make dynamite age-worthy Cabernets and Cab Francs too. We tend to make our Cab Franc in a more bell-ringing treble clef style, and you can see Cab Franc made through more of those, high-toned, Loire styles for, for a comparison, through to more extracted, darker, richer, longer oak aged Bordeaux styles. You're not going to find the California,
Right.
Franc styles.
No, because it's always a little lighter. Even people that are aiming towards that richer style still are going to deliver a lighter expression in comparison.
Right.
So with this particular wine, the Lenz, it was barrel fermented. They essentially stood the barrel on its side, popped the one end off, and put whole berries into the barrel and fermented that way. Again, really small production wine, 52 cases. So we're really lucky to be able to taste it today. I want to kind of talk about
Tom's doing a
Cabernet.
great job there too, and he's an awesome guy.
That's great. I want to keep talking about this wine, but alongside the Paumanok, wine 6, this is the so we just had Lenz 2020 Estate Selection Cabernet Franc. And then the final wine, number 6, is a Paumanok 2021 Assemblage. As you can see there, it's not only Cabernet Sauvignon, but a blend of Merlot, Petit Verdot, and Cabernet Franc. And the point to make is that means all of these wines, all of these varieties, hardy varieties, can be ripened there. I think sometimes we forget that Bordeaux is a highly maritime influenced, cooler climate region, simply because places like Napa have gotten so much attention for their Cabernet Sauvignon that we think of Cabernet as needing heat, but actually traditionally it was grown in very heavily maritime influenced cooler areas in a blended fashion like Paumanok is demonstrating here. So
in Friuli, they make great Cabernet too. I mean, look at the
absolutely.
Cabernet.
Yeah, absolutely. So we have here now 2 different examples of what we could maybe call a hardy red blend. And one in blend, one in pure Cabernet Franc. But Gabriella, we've talked about vintage 2022 with the Pinot Blanc. Most of the wines are 2021, including the Assemblage from Paumanok. But this, the Cabernet Franc is a 2020. Can you comment briefly on that particular vintage, growing conditions?
I'm laughing to myself because we call these warm vintages, but like the acid's through the roof here, right? Yeah. Like we're like, oh, it's a warm year. It's just like the wine is fresh and vibrant.
Growing degree days. It was hot. I mean, that's like Napa.
Right. But we're not getting that. It's, luckily we're not seeing 15, 16%, which Napa is struggling with, which Australia is struggling with like the poor people in Tuscany are freaking out about, right?
But to get that ripeness with these kind of acids is also what makes these wines last for 30 years,
100%. And I think, so acidity to me stands out, in that question. 2020. And it's great seeing these side by side, but I think that the biggest question here is like, is the sum greater than the parts, right? Like, do the points of the blend actually create more texture and complexity, or should we, be looking at each grape differently? And I think the beauty here is that Cabernet Franc has become something that people seek when they visit the region, and everyone's making. A lot of people are making Cab Franc, but here, like I poured the Assemblage, and the first thing I saw was just like inky purple color, and that's Petit Verdot, right?
But then go to the nose, and it's absolutely unquestionably a cool climate Bordeaux blend.
Totally.
It is, and Gabriella brings up Petit Verdot, and that is something that people should realize, because Petit Verdot has made a real statement over the last 15 years here, and I think is, equally with Merlot and Cabernet Franc and a few other great red varieties that I think is one of the just superstars here on Long Island. And it's also one of the few places in the world you can look to and taste many different examples of 100% Petit Verdot, because there aren't very many places that make Petit Verdot as a variety. As a variety, and there's tons of producers that are making Petit Verdot out here as a variety, and the wine is indestructible. It's the last thing we harvest, but it doesn't matter what you throw at it, it'll ripen up and take everything and still make really dynamite wine. So people should look for Petit Verdot and continue to see what Long Island is doing with Petit Verdot, because it's crazy.
Well, so one of the things that's come up in the other sessions is just this idea of what do we need to be thinking about in the future. And this is part of why hybrids are becoming more and more part of the conversation, because they do have more resistance. But the truth is that there are also vinifera varieties that have more resilience as well. Gamay actually handles a lot quite beautifully and hits that mid-weight red category, but Petit Verdot handles a lot from heat to cool to humidity and actually does really well.
The storms, like the
hardier,
tropical weather.
yeah, so from the hardier red variety. But Gabriella, you know, one of the things that's really important to you is thinking about the future of Long Island wine. So now that we've tasted through these 6 wines and talked about them in this broader context, do you have thoughts about like what's next? What are you excited about? What do you hope to see continue to grow in the region?
I think first and foremost excited about the energy, right? The energy from the consumers. Our tasting rooms are filled. We're sold out on Saturdays. Like, you have to book a reservation. The tasting rooms are filled. People are super excited. Our wine clubs, I know Christopher does a great job with his wine club. Like, our wine clubs are busier than ever. And I think that the answer is, you know, the energy of the teams working in this region is just like more vibrant than I've ever seen. People say that diversity is our strength. We're in the hurricane path. We talked about vintage variation. Like, yes, we make delicious rosé, and it's great because we can fall back on that if it rains for the entire month of October. But I truly think that that Chardonnay's become something that we really need to look at and really refocus. They're really good Chardonnays, but let's make a freaking awesome, world-class, mind-blowing Chard. And honestly, these red blends, but then we have such an audience. Like, why not Ramato? Why not like a textured kind of phenolic rosé? Like, why not Pet Nat? We just made a Gruner Pet Nat, and I sold 10 cases within the first 2 hours of it being released. I mean, it's just, they're fun, kind of entry level, kind of like get your palate wet and start thinking about the region. So I'm excited for a lot of things.
Yeah.
But I think it's just that energy within who we are and the people, you know, behind the scenes.
Well, one of the things to keep in mind too is, you know, diversity is a challenging marketing tool, right? Because then people don't know what the place is doing. But I mean, I think implicit in what you're describing, Gabriella, is that like there can be drivers for a region, you know, so like rosé opened the way for a lot of people to recognize Long Island makes great wine. Rosé can be a driver. These red blends like the Assemblage, that is like such a great example of how you can show the character of a region. Both these reds absolutely have that really mineral glittering signature that we talked about in the whites and the rosé as well. But the you know, but the red blends have that kind of long standing potential. Regardless of vintage, you can make it work, you know, and that can be a driver. These you know, I totally agree with you on Chardonnay. I think the long-term potential for excellent Chardonnay in Long Island is extremely high. And, you know, I love that the two of you have absolutely been committed to quality Chardonnay since you got started. And that can be an example for others that let's do this, you know. But then at the same time, you can have your drivers, and then you can say, these are delicious. Let's also do these. They're just smaller scale. So a couple of questions have come in. The Paumanok is a great example for answering one of them, which is like, you know, there is disease pressure. We touched on that, but what are some of the solutions? So I want to point out that Paumanok has a really strong investment in hands-on leaf pulling, really to help increase airflow. There is a nice persistent breeze through all of Long Island that helps mitigate some of the disease pressure, but the leaf pulling that not only helps with disease pressure, but it also helps make sure that sun exposure gets directly onto the fruit, which in a cooler climate with a shorter growing season, you want sun exposure. In a hot climate, you want to avoid sun exposure. So always remember that. Everything is in relation to context. Leaf pulling in a cooler region is valuable. It's really important. But do either of you want to comment briefly on other ways that disease pressure is mitigated? Or how, and also just the reality of vintage variation. How do you deal with it there?
We would say the best fertilizer is the farmer's footprint. Like, we are in the vineyards. Like, you see people in the vineyard, you see one little sign of powdery mildew, you've got to jump in there and take care of it, because if not, I mean, we lost 15 tons of Merlot in 21, right? Like, great vintage still, but we had a mildew situation. So you really have to walk the vineyards, and of course, airflow and canopy management.
Right. Christopher, one of the other questions that's come in is about sparkling wine. And, we've talked a little bit about vintage variation in the region. Can sparkling be done every year? Are there producers that rely almost entirely on sparkling? Like, can you comment on that?
Yeah, and I think it can, especially for traditional methods, you pick early. And so those producers that are focused on sparkling wine, we rarely pick in August here. It's usually, we have, and there's been some recent times, like last year, I think, or the year before, was it? Or, we started on Labor Day weekend, but they're picking in August, and that's often before, if the shit really is going to hit the fan in terms of weather, it happens. And there are producers that focus only on sparkling wine, Sparkling Point, which Mud planted and manages, and Gilles Martin is the winemaker for, only make sparkling wines, only traditional method sparkling wines. And those wines are awesome. And Wolfer makes a lot of sparkling wine, and a bunch of it. And look, there's, Eric also, and so did Roman, had so much to do with that too, because they did custom sparkling wines for so many people for so long, and taught people what it was and how to do it. And so there's just a ton of it. And yes, it's something that can be done like Rosé, I believe, in almost every vintage.
Well, so there's one more question that's come in. Elaine is very urgently wanting to know, like, what wines have enough distribution that they are being seen in other parts of the country, and if you have examples specifically for California. Do either of you go into California, but also what other producers do actually hit kind of broader distribution outside of the state?
We're in California, but
great distribution. Yeah.
Are you guys out there?
No, but we ship direct, right? So our wine club has grown so much that I've opened most states in America, and that's been a wild success. It's just people kind of finding us and us shipping direct.
Yeah, that's always a great solution. But and there are a lot of producers that are. Wolfer has wide distribution.
Yeah, probably the biggest in the region, right?
They're making 120,000 cases of Rosé, just
Rosé. Yeah.
Rosé.
And then they also make other wines. Yeah,
we make 10,000 cases of wine.
Let's be clear, it's a solid, delicious Rosé. Like, they're making a good drinkable Rosé at big distribution, and that's part of why it's bringing attention to the region, which is important.
But like Ramato's out in California, you can get Ramato from California to London to New York to Detroit and back.
How about sparkling wines? Do you know sparkling wines that are in distribution from Long Island?
I don't know.
Wolfer.
To be honest, it's funny. Wolfer. This question comes up a lot, and you realize like the tourism we see, right? We see like almost 2 million people a year, and so there's a thirsty market right here. So it's hard for us to focus on distribution. But that sort of angle of like looking at wineries and buying direct and kind of joining wine clubs if you like the wine, I think that's the move forward. And of course, like, if we can get there, we'll get there. If we can start distribution, we will.
Well, so
it's all about relationships. Distribution works when they find you and love you and sell it, and that lasts until those people
leave. They want to do the work,
starting over.
So if each of you have one takeaway you hope viewers remember about Long Island, what is that for each of you? Christopher, we'll start with you.
Quality and deliciousness.
Gabriella?
Yeah, I was just gonna say textured whites, because I'm like, I want more Ramato. My little bottle's empty. But no, honestly, like, I think that don't forget about white wine, right? Don't forget about the potential of pairing your local food with a local white.
All 6 of these are fantastic food wines, and for those of you that are lucky enough to get out to Long Island, either North or South Fork, there's an incredible food scene there, and the wines really just pair beautifully with local foods. There's lots of locally farmed meats, locally farmed produce, a ton of seafood though as well, and like Christopher was saying earlier, a great range of wines to go with all those things and how you want to prepare them. So thank you to both of you so much. This has been such a fun conversation, and it's been fun for me to get to relive some of the visits we've had in the past. So thank you. Thanks so much for sending the wines too. I'm in Alaska, and getting to taste Long Island is just like this lovely little reprieve.
That's
For-
awesome.
Yeah, it's pretty fun. So for those of you viewing, I want to remind you that this same time next week, we're going to have our final episode in this 4-part series, which will be focused on the Finger Lakes. For those of you that haven't seen the previous 2 episodes or who simply want to see them again, both the first 2 episodes are available already online. And if you were registered for any of the series, you'll be receiving a link to that recording in your email. So keep an eye out for that. But we do hope to see you again next week. If anybody has follow-up questions, please feel free to email. And thank you so much to the team at Adana Lane and New York State for making all of this happen. It's great to be with everybody.
Thanks, Elaine. Thanks, Gabriella.
Thank you. Good seeing everybody.
Thanks, Elaine. Thank you, panelists. And thank you to our attendees for participating today. As Elaine mentioned, a recording will be published and we'll actually send that to you in an email with the link. And also, I know Ella had dropped in the chat earlier the link to the grand celebration for the Long Island 50th anniversary that's taking place in the East End on August 19th at Paumanok Bay Vineyards. So if you are interested, do shoot us a note. I know you're all, trade and media, and we would love for you to attend. So please get in touch if you're available. And then the next episode will focus on the Finger Lakes. So that's August 16th at 4 p.m. The link to register is also in the chat if you have not yet done so. So enjoy the rest of your week. Thank you. Take care.